A rusted city bus sits alone in green Alaskan forest, and people keep dying to reach it. Not in a blizzard. In July, in shirt sleeves, within a day's walk of a road. One of them was Chris McCandless, who starved beside that bus in the summer of 1992. Interior Alaska is a place everyone pictures as a frozen death trap. Hundreds of thousands of roadless miles where Fairbanks hits 50 below. So blame the cold. Except the cold isn't what kills most people here. Summer is. Why does the warm season, not the cold, take the prepared, the careful, the almost rescued? Hold that question, because it runs under everything that follows, and start with the ground itself. Interior Alaska is the middle of the state, the huge sag of country trapped between two mountain walls. To the south stands the Alaska Range, the barrier that carries Denali, the highest peak on the continent. To the north runs the Brooks Range, the last mountains before the Arctic coast. Between them lies a basin the size of a large country. A rolling floor of black spruce, muskeg, braided rivers, and low-worn hills that geographers call the Yukon-Tanana Uplands. Fairbanks sits near the center of it, a city of a few tens of thousands. And once you leave its handful of roads, the map goes empty in a way that people from almost anywhere else have no reference for. It matters that this is the interior and not the coast, because most of the Alaska people picture is coastal. The cruise ships, the fishing ports, the glaciers calving into the sea, the temperate rainforest of the southeast panhandle, all of that is the maritime edge, moderated by the ocean and comparatively close to help. The interior is the opposite of all of it. It is the part of the state the sea never reaches, walled off by mountains, brutally dry and cold in winter, hot in summer, the most continental and least forgiving country Alaska has, and the least equipped with the things that make the coast survivable: ports, towns, roads, boats, neighbors. When people die in the interior, they are not dying in the Alaska of the brochures. They are dying in the enormous middle that the brochures leave blank, the part with no coastline to walk to, no harbor to run for, nothing on any horizon but more of the same country, which is exactly why a problem that would be a bad afternoon near the sea becomes a death sentence here. Not empty like a national park with trails and rangers every few miles. Empty like nothing. You can stand on a hilltop in the interior and turn a full circle and not see a single human mark on the land, and know that the same view continues for 100 miles in every direction. Now shrink that view down to one person standing in it, because that is the scale where the interior actually does its work. Not the map, not the statistics, but a single figure on a gravel bar beside a gray river, or in the doorway of a broken-down bus, or beside a tent on a lakeshore waiting for a plane. Everything this story is about happens at that scale, one person at a time, making ordinary decisions with incomplete information in a place that punishes small mistakes far out of proportion to how small they were. The country is enormous, and the tragedy is always tiny and specific. And the distance between those two facts, between the size of the land and the smallness of the person inside it, is most of what makes the interior lethal. Help, when it exists at all, is on the far side of that distance. That emptiness is the first thing that kills, and it kills quietly. The interior is served by exactly a few thin ribbons of pavement. The Parks Highway runs south from Fairbanks toward Anchorage. The Richardson runs southeast toward Valdez. The Steese and the Elliott and the Dalton claw north and east into country that swallows them. Away from those lines there are no roads at all, only rivers, game trails, old mining tracks growing back into brush, and the sky. And those rivers are not a detail. They are the interior's circulatory system, and always have been. The Yukon, one of the great rivers of North America, swings in an enormous arc across the whole of interior Alaska, gathering in tributaries that are themselves major rivers, the Tanana, the Koyukuk, the Porcupine, draining a basin so large it is hard to hold in the mind. Fairbanks sits on the Tanana's side of that system. The old gold camps and the native villages string along the banks like beads, because for thousands of years, and then for the gold century that followed, the water was the road. That is the thing to hold on to about this country. It is not organized around its few highways. It is organized around its rivers, which means the land funnels human movement onto and across moving water as a matter of basic geography. You cannot travel the interior for long without meeting a river you have to deal with, and every one of them is fed, in whole or in part, by the same mountains and the same melt, running the same daily and seasonal cycle, carrying the same cold and the same silt. The interior does not have a river problem in one unlucky spot. The interior is a river problem everywhere, all summer long. For most of the interior, the only practical way in or out is a small airplane on floats, skis, or fat tundra tires, landing on a gravel bar or a lake or a strip of tundra that a bush pilot has decided is good enough. There is no cell coverage across the overwhelming majority of this land. A satellite phone or a personal locator beacon works if you carried one, and if it can see the sky, and if the weather lets an aircraft fly, and if an aircraft is available, and if the people who could come are not already committed somewhere else, in a state twice the size of Texas, with a fraction of the rescue assets. Every one of those ifs is a link in a chain, and the interior specializes in breaking chains. And the strange part, the part that makes the reputation so hard to argue with, is that the cold here really is that absolute. This is not a place that is merely cold. About 160 miles north of Fairbanks, at a pipeline camp called Prospect Creek, a thermometer on the 23rd of January 1971 recorded a temperature of nearly 80 below zero Fahrenheit, minus 62 Celsius. And half a century later, that reading still stands as the coldest ever officially measured anywhere in the United States. On that same day, Fairbanks itself dropped to 55 below. Those are not numbers a body reasons with. At 80 below, exposed skin freezes in a couple of minutes, breath crackles, steel grows brittle enough to snap, tires freeze flat on one side and thud like square wheels, and diesel fuel thickens toward jelly in the tank. When people call the interior a frozen death trap, they are not exaggerating the temperature. The interior owns the coldest figure the country has ever produced, and it is not close. That extreme is geography acting on air the same way it acts on everything else here. The interior sits deep in the heart of a northern continent, sealed off from the sea and its moderating warmth by the wall of the Alaska Range to the south, and an inland place cut off from the ocean gets the most violent temperature swings on the planet, the pure continental climate. The same ground that reads 80 below in the dark of January can read the high 80s in July. That is a swing of something like 170 degrees across a single year. And every living thing in the interior, the spruce, the rivers, the animals, the people, exists inside that swing. Beneath the surface, much of the interior is permafrost, ground that never fully thaws, so that even at the height of summer, you are walking on a thin, sodden skin of melt laid over a floor of permanent ice. Water cannot drain through frozen ground, which is why so much of the country turns to muskeg and standing bog in the warm months, and why the rivers carry off so much of what the season releases. That frozen floor is itself starting to move, and where it thaws, it rearranges the country in ways that matter to anyone traveling through it. When permafrost melts, the ground it was holding up slumps and caves into pits and hollows that fill with water. A pocked, sinking terrain scientists call thermokarst. Stands of spruce tilt into what people here call drunken forest, and solid-looking ground turns to bog. Trails and old roots that were reliable for generations can soften and drown. It is one more way the interior's timing is coming loose from the knowledge built to read it. The very surface of the land shifting underfoot as the ice that shaped it gives way. None of this makes the country gentler. A thawing interior is a wetter, softer, less predictable one, harder to cross on foot rather than easier, and it is changing the map faster than the maps can keep up. Hold all of that against the map, because the scale is the other half of the sentence. Alaska is enormous, more than twice the size of Texas, and the interior is the vast middle of it. And across that middle, the human footprint is almost nothing. A few hundred miles of highway. A scattering of small communities, many of them reachable only by air or river. Between them, a roadless expanse measured not in the gaps between towns, but in the gaps between anything at all. And that combination, the deepest cold on the continent laid over one of the emptiest inhabited spaces on it, is what fixes the interior in everyone's mind as a place that kills you by freezing you. Which is exactly the assumption this story is going to take apart. Because the 80 below record, for all its menace, quietly tells you something about how the cold actually behaves toward people. Cold that's severe is not subtle. It does not let you wander into it and discover your mistake an hour later. It hits the instant you are unprotected, and it forces a level of respect and preparation that, most of the time, keeps people alive because nobody treats 80 below casually. The danger that announces itself that loudly is not the danger that catches the careful. The one that catches the careful waits for the warm months, when the same country that can freeze mercury takes off its most obvious threat and puts on its least obvious one. Here is the mechanism in its simplest form, the thing the cold hides. In winter, the interior is locked and legible. The rivers are frozen into highways. The ground is hard. You can travel a straight line across a frozen slough that in summer would be an impassable bog. The danger in January is obvious, and it announces itself because 40 and 50 below does not sneak up on anyone. You feel it the instant you step outside, and it forces respect. Summer is the liar. In summer, the interior looks like a postcard. The light lasts almost around the clock. The temperature climbs into the 70s and 80s. Mosquitoes, not frostbite, feel like the main enemy. And it is exactly then, when the country looks most forgiving, that it becomes hardest to move through and hardest to leave, because the frozen highways have melted and turned back into what they always were underneath: water. To understand how that water works, you have to follow it uphill to where it comes from, and that means going back to those two mountain walls. The peaks of the Alaska Range are buried in ice. Glaciers sit in their valleys like slow rivers of frozen rock and snow, and all summer long the sun works on them. Meltwater pours off the ice, gray and cold, carrying a load of ground-up stone that the glaciers have been grinding for centuries. That gray water is the signature of an interior river, and the Teklanika, the river at the center of this whole story, is one of them. The Teklanika begins at the Cantwell Glacier, high in the Alaska Range, and runs north out of the mountains into the flats. Geologists call a river like this braided, because it does not hold a single channel. It spreads across a wide gravel floodplain in a shifting net of streams that split and rejoin and wander from week to week, dropping their load of stone, building bars, cutting new paths. You can walk across a braided river in a dozen shallow strands in the cool of a spring morning and barely wet your knees. Now add the two things that summer does to that river, and watch the trap close. The first is seasonal. The glaciers feed the river most heavily when they are melting hardest, and they melt hardest in the warm months. So an interior river is not at its lowest in summer, the way a rain-fed river in the lower states runs down in a dry August. It is at its highest. The volume that a river like the Teklanika carries in July can be many times what it carried in the frozen calm of April, and that water is not water you can reason with. It is opaque, so you cannot see the bottom or judge the depth, or spot the drop-off that will take your footing. It is a few degrees above freezing, straight off the ice, and it is moving with the dumb, heavy force of everything the mountains are shedding all at once. The second thing is daily. Glacial melt follows the sun. The ice melts fastest in the afternoon heat, and it takes hours for that pulse of water to travel down out of the mountains and reach the flats. So a braided interior river breathes on a daily cycle. It is often lowest in the cold hours near dawn, and highest in the late afternoon and evening, and the difference between the two can be the difference between an easy wade and a channel that will knock a grown adult off their feet. A person who crosses a river at 7 in the morning and plans to cross back at 6 in the evening is, without knowing it, planning to cross two different rivers. This is not folklore. It is hydrology, and it is measured. And it is exactly the sort of thing that does not occur to someone whose entire life has taught them that a river is a fixed object you can see and step over. It helps to know what that gray actually is, because the color is not cosmetic. It is the whole reason the water behaves the way it does. Glaciers do not simply melt, they grind. As they creep downhill, they drag the rock beneath them and crush stone into a powder so fine it is called rock flour, and the meltwater carries that powder in suspension, which is what turns an interior river the flat, opaque gray of wet cement. People call it glacial milk. That suspended rock does three things to you, and none of them are in your favor. It makes the water opaque, so you cannot read the depth, cannot see the bottom fall away, cannot spot the deep channel until you are standing in it. It makes the water abrasive and heavy, a slurry rather than a clear stream, so the same speed of current carries more push than clean water would. And once you are in it, that fine grit works into everything, packing into boots and pockets and the weave of your clothes, loading you with waterlogged weight in exactly the places that will drag you under. A river you can see through is a river you can judge. A glacial river gives you nothing to judge by until it already has you. And you do not even have to be swept off your feet by the current to be taken, because the riverbed itself is a hazard. A braided glacial river runs over loose cobbles and shifting gravel, and a wading foot can slide into a gap between stones and wedge there. And once a foot is pinned in fast water, the current does the rest, folding the body forward and downstream, the face driven toward a surface it cannot reach. Rescuers call it foot entrapment, and it is a documented killer in exactly this kind of water. The reason experienced people are taught never to plant a foot. They cannot instantly pull back and never to wait a strong current the way they would walk across a room. To a first-timer, a river bottom is just the ground under the water. In a glacial river, it is a field of traps, hidden under the gray, waiting for a foot to go somewhere it cannot come back from. And the person standing in the current has no way of knowing any of it is there until it has already closed on them. Put those together, and you have the killing machine. And it is worth walking through what it actually does to a human body, because the number that matters here is not depth in inches, but what the water does in seconds. Step into a fast interior river in June, and the first thing that hits you is the cold. And the cold is not a discomfort. It is a physiological ambush. Water that cold triggers a gasp reflex the instant it reaches your chest. An involuntary inhalation you cannot override. And if your face is in the water when it fires, you inhale the river. Within a minute, your hands stop working the way you need them to. The fine control goes first, then the grip. So the exact moment you most need to hold a rope or a branch or a trekking pole is the moment your fingers turn into blunt hooks that will not close. That is before the current has done anything at all. Then, the current does something. Moving water pushes with a force that climbs steeply as it gets faster and deeper, far faster than intuition expects. So a channel that felt like nothing at your shins becomes an immovable wall at your thighs. Once it is above your knees and moving hard, You are no longer standing on the bottom so much as bracing against a machine. And the gray color, the silt, is not just cosmetic. That suspended rock is abrasive and it is heavy. And it does two things people never anticipate. It fills. Boots, pockets, the inside of a jacket, a pack. All of it takes on a load of waterlogged grit that drags you down and pins you. And it robs you of the one instinct you might have counted on. Because silt-choked glacial water is denser and colder and more chaotic than the clear lake you learned to swim in. And it does not hold you up. People who could swim laps in a pool have gone under in interior rivers in the time it takes to read this sentence. Because the thing they trained on and the thing in front of them only look like the same substance. Cold water researchers in the North have a shorthand for how this goes, taught to boaters across Alaska and Canada, and it is called the 1-10-1. It is not a slogan. It is a schedule of your own body failing, and it maps almost perfectly onto what a glacial river does to a person who goes into it. The first one is 1 minute, the cold shock minute. The instant that near-freezing water closes over you, your breathing detonates, a huge involuntary gasp followed by hyperventilation that can run 6 to 10 times your normal rate, entirely outside your control, no matter how calm you are trying to be. If your head is under when that gasp fires, you inhale the river, and it is finished before hypothermia is even a factor. The 10 is the next 10 minutes or so, cold incapacitation, and it is the cruelest stretch because you stay conscious and clear-headed while your body stops answering you. The blood pulls to your core, your hands and arms and legs cool and weaken, your grip goes, coordinated swimming becomes impossible, and the window to reach a bank or a branch or a rope closes while you are still awake to watch it close. Only after that, if you have somehow kept your airway clear, does the last one arrive, roughly an hour before your core temperature falls far enough for hypothermia itself to take your consciousness. The record behind that schedule is not theoretical, and it is written in the North's own dead. Alaska's commercial fishing fleet works the coldest productive water in the country, and it has been studied closely, and in the years from 1990 through 2002, more than 200 fishermen there died from cold water immersion and the drowning that follows it. The overwhelming majority, well over 90%, from drowning or drowning, combined with hypothermia. Here is the finding that matters most for a river like the Teklenica. More than half of those deaths happened in the 2 stages before hypothermia had even set in. In that first minute and those first 10 minutes, in the cold shock and the incapacitation, not in the long, slow cooling most people picture when they hear the word hypothermia. What kills in cold water is almost never the temperature patiently winning. It is the gasp and the failed hands, fast, at the very start. 2 things follow from that, and both cut straight to the crossings this story is heading toward. The first is that what saves people in cold water, over and over in the fishing data, is flotation, a life jacket or an immersion suit, something that holds the airway above the surface through that killing first minute when the body cannot help itself. A person wading an interior river on foot has none of it. They have a pack that fills and drags, boots that load with silt, and no flotation at all, which means the single factor most strongly tied to surviving cold water immersion is the exact factor they are missing. The second is that a rope tying you to the bank, the thing that feels like the responsible precaution, does the opposite of flotation. Flotation lifts your face clear so you can survive the minute. A fixed rope in a current holds you down inside it. That difference is invisible from the bank, and it is the whole distance between a scare and a death, and it is the difference one crossing on the Teklenica would eventually turn on. And getting out of the water is not the same as being safe, which is the last thing people underestimate. A person who fights clear of a glacial river and reaches a bank is soaked to the skin in near-freezing water, in wind, often miles from shelter with no way to make fire fast. And the cold that started working in the river keeps right on working on land. Wet clothing pulls heat out of a body many times faster than dry air, and hypothermia does not need immersion to finish what immersion began. It needs only wet, wind, and time, all of which the interior hands out for free. The shivering, the clumsiness, the confusion, the slow shutdown of a brain cooling past the point of good decisions can arrive on the bank as surely as in the current. More than one person in this country has survived the water only to die of it afterward, on solid ground, because reaching shore felt like the end of the emergency when it was only the middle of it. So the chain is complete before anyone has made a single foolish decision. Geography builds a basin with no exits but rivers. The mountains store ice. Summer heat converts the ice into moving water on a daily and seasonal rhythm most visitors have never heard of. The water is cold enough to disable, opaque enough to hide its depth, silt heavy enough to sink you, and it rises through the day so that the ground you crossed this morning is gone by tonight. And all of it sits inside a roadless country where, if it takes you, the nearest help is not minutes away but hours or days, dependent on aircraft, weather, and luck. The interior does not need a storm or a blizzard to kill a careful person, it just needs the sun to come out. Put a number on that force, because the number is where intuition fails worst. Moving water pushes on a body roughly with the square of its speed, which means a current that doubles in pace does not hit twice as hard, it hits about 4 times as hard. A flow that is a gentle nudge at a slow walking pace becomes at a brisk one, a load a strong adult simply cannot stand against. And a braided glacial river in full afternoon melt is moving faster than that. Knee-deep is the threshold nearly everyone misjudges. Water at the knee, moving hard, is already pressing on the legs with more force than most people can brace. And the instant it lifts a foot off the bottom, the whole body turns into a sail for the current to carry. People look at a river and judge it by depth, by how far up their bodies the water will come. And depth is the wrong measure. Speed is the measure. And speed is the one thing the flat gray surface of a glacial river refuses to show you right up until you are standing in it and feeling your own weight begin to go. The people who lived in this country for thousands of years understood every link in that chain, and they understood it without a single measurement, which is the part outsiders keep failing to take seriously. The interior is the homeland of Athabascan peoples, the Dini, whose languages and territories spread across it in a mosaic, the Koyukon along the lower Yukon and Koyukuk, the Gwich'in in the northeast toward the Brooks Range, the Tanana and Han, and others through the central river country. Their survival did not come from conquering this land or from carrying more gear than it could take away. It came from reading it, from treating the country as a system with a schedule, and from moving in time with that schedule rather than against it. That knowledge was not decoration, and it was not mysticism. It was an observation system as rigorous as any instrument, built and corrected over countless generations, and it was organized around exactly the hazards that still kill people today. Rivers were the highways and the larders, so rivers were studied the way a sailor studies the sea. People knew which season and which hour a given crossing was safe, and which it was not. They knew that the melt swelled the water in the long days of summer, and that the safe time to move heavy loads across might be the cold of early morning or the freeze of autumn, not the convenient afternoon. Break up in spring, when the river ice shatters and stampedes downstream in a chaos of grinding flows, and freeze up in fall, when the new ice is treacherously thin, were understood as specific, dangerous, named passages of the year, not as background scenery. Consider just one of those passages, Breakup, because it shows how exact this reading of the land had to be. When the river ice goes out in spring, it does not politely melt in place. It shatters and moves, enormous rafts of ice grinding downstream in a matter of hours or days, jamming into dams that can throw the water up many feet almost without warning, and then release it in a surge that scours the banks. Knowing close to the day when a given river was going to break, and knowing to be off it and well back from it when it did, was not a refinement. It was the difference between an ordinary spring and a drowned one. The people of the interior watched for it with an attention the modern world only imitates, reading the snow, the angle of the sun, the color and the sound of the ice, the small signs that a river was about to come alive under its own cover. Winter travel demanded a second literacy, the knowledge of overflow, where water is forced up on top of solid river ice and then hidden under a thin, innocent blanket of snow, so that a traveler who punches through soaks his legs and feet at 30 or 40 below, which without immediate fire is a death measured in minutes. None of this was written down in the outsider's sense of writing. It lived in language, in place names that were really instructions, in stories that encoded exactly where and when the country turned on you, and in the hard correction of anyone who guessed wrong. Added together, it was a complete working model of the land's physics, tuned over thousands of years, and it is a model no newcomer has ever carried in on the first trip, or in most cases, ever. The larder itself demanded the same reading. The interior is boreal forest, taiga, and it is far less generous than its green summers suggest. The game is lean, and its numbers swing. The caribou move in herds that follow their own long routes across enormous country, present one season and gone the next. So a people who depended on them had to know those routes and those timings the way a farmer knows a field. Salmon ran up the great rivers on their own calendar, and whole patterns of life were built around meeting them at the right place in the right week, drying and storing enough in the brief window to carry through a winter that could run 7 or 8 months. Fish wheels and weirs and drying racks were technologies of timing as much as of catching. Everything was preparation against a season when the country gives almost nothing, when the cold locks the land and the stored food is all there is. This is the part that people romanticizing self-reliance tend to miss entirely. Living off the interior was never a matter of being tough or resourceful in a single heroic moment. It was a matter of an enormous body of inherited, specific, local knowledge, applied with discipline across a whole year, with the hardest work done in the seasons of plenty precisely so the seasons of scarcity would not kill you. A newcomer arriving in spring with a rifle and good intentions was not entering that system. He was standing outside it in the same forest, mistaking the summer's surface abundance for a pantry, and the distance between those two things has starved more than one confident person who believed the land would simply provide. And underneath all of it sat a discipline that the modern world is remarkably bad at, the discipline of not going. The single most important survival skill in a country like this is knowing when the right move is to stay put, to wait out a river in flood, to hold in camp until the ice is thick enough or the water is low enough, to let the season give you back the root it took away. That restraint is invisible in any story built around a heroic push, which is why it almost never makes it into the popular version of Alaska. But it is the actual technology that kept people alive here for millennia, and every death this story is going to walk through without exception is in some form a death that came from being unwilling or unable to wait. Because that is the collision at the heart of the interior. The land runs on its own schedule, indifferent, physical, and precise. And almost everyone who comes to it from outside brings a different schedule with them, an external clock made of flights and food supplies and vacation days and ambitions and the simple human need to be somewhere by a certain time. The land does not negotiate with that clock. It never has. The whole grim history of outsiders dying in this country is, at bottom, the history of two schedules meeting, and of people discovering far too late that only one of them is real. That collision has a long history here, and it did not begin with lost hikers. The interior's first great wave of outsiders came for gold. Through the 1880s and 1890s, prospectors pushed up the Yukon and its tributaries into the heart of Alaska, throwing up raw camps at places like 40 Mile and Circle City. And when the Klondike strike hit in 1897, the trickle became a stampede. Tens of thousands of people flooding toward the goldfields with almost no grasp of the country they were entering. A few years later, in 1902, a strike in the hills north of the Tanana founded Fairbanks itself. And the whole of that world ran on the rivers, because the rivers were the only highways there were. Sternwheel steamboats carried people and freight up the Yukon and the Tanana in summer. In winter, when the water froze, dog teams ran the ice roads the rivers left behind. Everything, the supply, the mail, the gold, the people, moved on the interior's schedule of break-up and freeze-up, and everyone learned, often fatally, that the schedule was not open to negotiation. Men drowned crossing rivers they misjudged. Men froze when the cold came faster than they respected. Men starved in cabins waiting out winters they had underestimated, chasing an external clock made of grub stakes and claims and the next boat out, in a country that kept only its own clock. The gear has changed beyond recognition since. The steamboat became the bush plane. The grub stake became a vacation. The gold became a photograph or a pilgrimage. The trap did not change at all. It was catching ambitious outsiders on the interior's rivers 100 years before Carl McCunn ever stepped off a float plane onto a lake he assumed he could leave. Carl McCunn brought a schedule. In the spring of 1981, he was a well-liked, easygoing amateur photographer in his early 30s. An Alaskan by adoption who had come up from Texas and fallen hard for the country, and he wanted the kind of photographs you can only get by staying. So he arranged the thing that makes the modern interior possible and dangerous in the same breath. He hired a bush pilot to fly him out to a remote lake in the northeastern interior, up near the Colleen River, on the southern flank of the Brooks Range, roughly 225 miles from Fairbanks. Out there, he would be utterly alone with the caribou and the waterfowl and the light for months, which was exactly the point. Look at what he carried, because it tells you he was not a fool and he was not unequipped. He flew in with something like 500 rolls of film, which is the detail that says everything about his intentions. He brought around 1,400 pounds of provisions. He brought 2 rifles and a shotgun. By the standard of a weekend adventurer, he was carrying a fortress. He had food, he had firepower, he had the means to feed himself off the land on top of what he packed, and he had a plan to be picked up and flown back to Fairbanks before winter closed the country down. On the day the float plane lifted off the lake and the sound of its engine faded into that 100-mile silence, Carl McCunn was, by any reasonable measure, a man in control of his situation. He was in control of everything except the one link he never nailed down. He believed the pilot would return for him in August. He believed it, but he had not confirmed it, had not fixed a hard date and a hard arrangement that someone else was holding up on their end. In a city, that gap is nothing. You make a call, you follow up, you sort it out. In the interior, that gap is the whole game. Because out there, the arrangement to leave is not a convenience, it is the only thread connecting you to the rest of the human race, and a thread you have only assumed is tied is not tied. The summer burned down. He shot his photographs, he lived his dream, he filled his journal. The months alone did their own quiet work too, in the way the interior works on anyone who stays out long by themselves. The summer light barely sets, so there is no real night to mark the days, and time smears. The isolation is total, no voice, no face, no one to check a decision against. And the country is physically wearing, even when it is not trying to kill you, The clouds of mosquitoes and biting flies that rise off the muskeg in summer, thick enough to torment a person hour after hour, drawing blood, breaking sleep, grinding down patience and judgment. None of that on its own is fatal. All of it together erodes the sharpness a person needs at exactly the moment the margin is thinning, and it helps explain how a capable, well-supplied man, month after solitary month, can slide from living a dream to keeping an accounting of his own death without any single dramatic moment marking the turn. And August came, and the sky over the lake stayed empty. Sit with what that emptiness actually meant, physically, on the ground. He could not walk out. 200-plus miles of roadless interior, braided rivers running high, with exactly the glacial melt this story has been describing, muskeg and brush and no trail, stood between him and Fairbanks. And a man on foot carrying what he could carry does not cross that country against the season and win. He had no radio that could raise anyone. He had no way to send a message. The float on which his whole plan rested, the return flight, simply had not materialized. And there was no second plan underneath it because he had spent his one arrangement on an assumption. His food, that 1,400 pounds, had been calculated for a summer, not for a summer and a fall and the beginning of an Arctic winter. It began slowly and then not slowly to run out. Watch how the arrangement actually failed, because it is the most ordinary failure imaginable, and that is the horror of it. There was no dramatic betrayal, no crash, no storm that stranded him. The confirmed, paid, dated pickup that his life depended on had simply never been locked down as a hard commitment with someone obligated to come for him. In the city that is a missed appointment, you fix with a phone call. Out there, it was the whole difference between living and dying, and it turned on nothing more than an assumption never nailed down. His journal through those weeks becomes a slow, meticulous accounting of a man realizing exactly this. He wrote about the shrinking food. He wrote about the cold coming on and the light going short. He wrote about rationing what was left and hunting to stretch it, and about the growing certainty that the sky was going to stay empty. It is not the diary of a man panicking. It is the diary of a man doing careful arithmetic and watching the answer come out death, and writing it down anyway, which is somehow worse. And then the interior did the cruelest thing it knows how to do. It offered him a chance, and let him misread it. An airplane came. The accounts of exactly when and how differ, and that disagreement is itself part of the record. So hold both versions. In Carl McCunn's own journal, the one later recovered from his camp, he described a plane passing over, and he described his own reaction to it in a passage that is almost unbearable to read precisely because he wrote it himself, in hindsight, understanding what he had done. He recorded raising his right hand, shoulder high, and shaking his fist at the aircraft on its second pass, a gesture he described as a little cheer, the kind of thing you do when your team scores. And then, in the diary, the hammer falls in his own words. That gesture, one arm raised, is the standardized signal that means all is well, assistance not necessary. The signal for send help, the one that might have brought that plane back, is two arms raised straight up. He had waved the wrong shape at the sky. To the people in that aircraft, a man standing by a camp with one arm up was a man telling them he was fine. There is a second version in the record, and honesty requires putting it beside the first rather than choosing the more dramatic one. An Alaska State Trooper later recounted flying over that lake, and in that telling, the pilot saw a man near his tent waving something red in a loose, casual way, and on another pass saw him strolling unhurried back toward the tent, and read all of it, reasonably, as a person in no distress at all. Whether it was a single misunderstood pass or a series of them, whether it turned on a hand signal or on a red bag or on simple, relaxed body language seen from a moving aircraft, the outcome converges to the same unforgiving point, and that point is the first hard lesson of the interior. He was seen. A human being in an aircraft looked directly at Carl McCunn and flew away, and did not come back because nothing about him read as an emergency from the air. Being spotted is not the same as being rescued. The country will let you be found and still keep you. After that, the journal becomes a record of a man doing the arithmetic of his own situation and watching the answer come out wrong. He rationed. He hunted to stretch what he had. He watched the temperature start to slide and the light start to shorten, and he understood, with the clarity that comes when there is nothing left to hope your way around, that no one was coming before the country froze, and that a Brooks Range winter was going to arrive at his tent and find him with no food and no way out. His entries turned from the log of an adventure into something else, an accounting of cold and hunger and the slow closing of every door. In the end, weak, starving, and certain of what the winter would do, Carl McCunn took his own life rather than let it be done to him slowly. His body and his journal were found the following February, on the 2nd, by Alaska State Troopers who landed a ski-equipped plane on the frozen lake after friends and family, alarmed that he had never come home, finally raised enough concern to send someone to look. The story he had written was sitting right there beside him, the whole descent in his own hand. The timing of that discovery is its own quiet indictment. He had flown in around the start of spring and was not found until the following February, the better part of a year. And he was only found then because people who cared about him back in the world had grown worried enough at his silence to push someone to go and look. In a country wired the way most of the modern world is wired, a man who misses his own return by weeks sets off alarms almost at once. Out there, the alarm took months to travel, and by the time it did, the answer was already frozen into the ground beside the lake. Everything about the case points at the same single failure this story keeps returning to. Not a lack of supplies, not a lack of courage, not the cold as such, but a broken link in the thin chain that connects a person in that country to the possibility of coming home, and a distance so large that even the worry of the people who loved him could not cross it in time to matter. What Carl McCunn proves, the thing that makes his death the right door into this country rather than just a sad footnote, is that the interior's deadliest ingredient is not weather, and not even the river. It is isolation converted into helplessness by the failure of a single link. He did not die because he was reckless with the cold. He prepared for the cold with a fortress of supplies. He did not die in a storm. He died in the gentle end of summer and the early fall, in daylight, in a camp, healthy and well-armed, because the one thin thread that connected him to rescue was never actually fastened, and because when the country handed him a second chance in the form of an aircraft overhead, the distance and the speed and the sheer difficulty of communicating anything real across that gap turned his relief into a signal that told his rescuers to leave. Everything after that was just time. And it raises the obvious objection, the one a modern viewer is already forming, which is that this was 1981, and surely the thing that killed Carl McCunn was solved a long time ago. Surely the whole reason the interior is reachable at all, the small airplane, is also the answer to the small airplane's failure. It is, and that is precisely the trap. The bush plane is the single piece of technology that opened the interior to ordinary people, and it deserves the credit it gets. Before the aircraft, reaching a lake near the Colleen River meant weeks of brutal overland travel that only a handful of people alive could have survived, so the country was effectively closed to anyone without deep local skill. The float plane and the ski plane and the tundra-tired tail dragger collapsed that. Suddenly, a photographer from Texas could be standing on a wilderness lakeshore a few hours after breakfast in Fairbanks. Alaska became, and remains, the most aviation-dependent place in the United States, a state where small planes do the work that roads and trains do everywhere else, where villages are supplied by air and a huge share of adults either fly or fly regularly as passengers in aircraft smaller than a car. The numbers on that dependence are sobering, and they matter here because they prove that even the tool that opened the interior never actually conquered it. For decades, Alaska has flown at an accident rate far above the rest of the country. Across 2008 to 2017, the state's overall aviation accident rate ran about 2.33 times the national average, and its fatal rate roughly a third higher. Reach back to the 1970s, and the air taxi crash rate was on the order of 5 times the national figure. For general aviation over 2004 to 2008, Alaska recorded close to 14 accidents for every 100,000 flying hours, more than double the country as a whole. Investigators have named the causes without much comfort. Weather leads the list, the same low cloud and fog and fast-changing conditions the interior manufactures, luring or trapping pilots into terrain and murk they cannot see through. Thin airfields and sparse navigation aids add to it. And there is a human factor the National Transportation Safety Board has named outright Bush Syndrome, the pressure on a pilot to finish the flight, to deliver the hunter or the mail or the supplies or the passengers to a strip that is waiting, to push into weather that should turn him around. Because in this country, the flight is not a convenience. It is the road. And lives and livelihoods are stacked on it. Which is the interior's oldest trap wearing a headset. The airplane did not lift the country's fundamental condition. It moved the schedule into the cockpit, handed the pressure a throttle, and every year some of the people who trusted that schedule do not come home, in exactly the way the roads elsewhere do not routinely kill the people who merely drive them. That is the improvement. Here is the limit that no amount of improvement erases, and it is the reversal Carl McCunn was the first in this story to demonstrate. The airplane solved distance, but it solved distance by turning your life into a scheduled event that depends on other people, machines, weather, and fuel all lining up at once. It did not make the country smaller. It made you dependent on a link, and a link can break. The plane needs weather to fly, and the interior manufactures weather that grounds aircraft for days at a stretch. The plane needs to know you are in trouble, and from 1,000 feet, a dying man and a happy man can wave the same arm. The plane needs to have been asked to come on a date that someone confirmed. Aviation did not remove the interior's fundamental sentence, which is that you are only ever as safe as your ability to leave. It just moved that sentence up into the sky and made it look solved. And a danger that looks solved is more dangerous than one that looks obvious, because people stop respecting it. Carl McCunn did not fear the emptiness enough to nail down his flight, because the flight felt like a certainty, the way a booked ticket feels like a certainty. The interior taught him, and it will keep teaching, that out here nothing is booked. Which brings the story to the specific piece of water that has taught this lesson more times, and more publicly than any other, and to the man whose name made it famous. Because the airplane at least offers the fantasy of a fast exit. A river offers nothing. A river is the interior's oldest and most patient trap, and to see how it works, you have to go back to the Tiklanaka. Trace it again, but now as a route rather than a diagram. West of Fairbanks and north of Denali National Park runs an old, half-abandoned track called the Stampede Trail, cut in the mid-20th century toward mining claims and never finished into a real road. It starts near the small community of Healy, off the park's highway, and it runs west into the bush. And for the first few miles, it is easy, a pleasant walk through spruce and open country that gives no warning of what it is walking you toward. Put real distances on it because the distances are part of the deception. From the point where the drivable road gives out, it is roughly 20 miles of trail to the bus, A long day's walk, but not an outrageous one for a fit person. The first real river is the Savage, at about mile 7.5. The second, at about mile 10, is the Teclanica. So the Killing Crossing sits only around 10 miles in, half the way to the bus. Close enough that on the map, it looks like the easy part of the trip. The part you do before the real distance begins. That is the trap's geometry. The Teclanica is not buried deep in some remote fastness that warns you with its remoteness. It is right there near the front of the walk, in country that still feels close to the highway, which is exactly why people cross it casually on the way in when it is low, and are stunned by it on the way out when it is not. 10 miles from pavement does not feel like a place a person can die. It is. That crossing is the hinge on which every death here turns. In the spring, before the mountains have really begun to melt, the Teclanica at that crossing can be a modest, braided, shin-to-knee deep spread of channels, cold but crossable. The kind of water a reasonably fit person walks through without much drama. That is the river most people meet on the way in. The river on the way out, weeks later, in the full heat of summer, is a different animal wearing the same name. There is a bitter irony folded into that river's name because most people who have heard of the Teclanica met it as something gentle. The same river, upstream and to the south, runs through Denali National Park, and the park road crosses it. And for decades, the standard way to see Denali has been from the window of a park bus rolling out along that road, past a rest area on the Teclanica, where visitors climb out to photograph the braided gray channels and the grizzlies and caribou that use the open gravel like a highway. Hundreds of thousands of people a year pass through Denali, and a good share of them meet the Teclanica exactly this way, tamed to a scenic backdrop, a pretty gray river you look at from a safe road with a ranger narrating. That is the Teclanica the world knows. The Teclanica on the Stampede Trail, a short distance north and outside the park's managed road, is the same water with none of the management, no bridge, no road, no ranger, no driver who knows the country. It is the identical river showing its other face, and the gap between the two, between the one you photograph and the one you ford, is a fair summary of the whole interior. It looks like scenery. It is not scenery, and a few miles beyond that crossing, in a clearing in the spruce, sits the bus. It is worth knowing exactly what the bus is, because the myth has almost swallowed the object. It is Fairbanks City Transit System Bus 142, a 1946 International Harvester, and it did not wander out into the wilderness on its own or get placed there for any romantic reason. In 1961, the Utan Construction Company was building an access road out along what became the Stampede Trail, and it needed to house its crew. So it took 4 retired city buses, pulled their engines, and dragged them out into the bush behind bulldozers to serve as bunkhouses. When the work ended, most were hauled back. Bus 142 broke an axle out on the trail, and rather than fight it, the crew left it where it sat. For the next 30 years, it did quiet, useful work as a backcountry shelter, a dry box with bunks and a stove where hunters, trappers, and the occasional ranger patrol could get out of the weather. It was, in other words, a completely ordinary piece of Alaskan practicality, a bus that happened to stop being a bus and started being a roof. For most of its life out there, the bus was not a symbol of anything. It was shelter, and it was used the way shelter is used in a country that has almost none. Hunters bunked in it. Trappers running lines used it. A family connected to that original road crew even lived in it for a time in the early 60s. Ranger patrols sheltered in it. People left firewood and a few supplies for whoever came next, the quiet etiquette of the bush, where a dry roof and a stove 20 miles from the road can be the difference between a hard night and a dangerous one. That is the thing the legend erased. Bus 142 was a genuinely useful object doing a genuinely useful job for 30 years before it became famous. And the people who relied on it knew the country it sat in, knew the river in front of it, and came and went in step with the seasons. It only became a killer when it stopped being a tool and started being a destination, when people began coming not for the shelter, but for the story, and crossing the river not because the country made sense that day, but because the bus was on the other side. Nobody outside the small world of Stampede Trail users had any reason to know it existed. That anonymity ended in 1992, and it ended because of a young man named Christopher McCandless. His objective is easy to state and easy, even now, to feel. McCandless was in his early 20s, bright, intense, well-read, from a comfortable East Coast family, and he had spent 2 years shedding that comfort on purpose, giving away his savings, drifting through the West under a self-chosen name, testing how much of ordinary life he could strip off and still be himself. Alaska was meant to be the culmination of that, the real thing. An extended solo immersion in true wilderness where he would live off the land and off his own resourcefulness. In late April of 1992, on the 28th, a local man gave him a lift to the head of the Stampede Trail and let him out. McCandless walked west with a rifle, a bag of rice, some books, a light kit, and very little else. And this is the point that the popular argument gets stuck on, and the point this story needs you to see past. Yes, he was under-equipped and under-prepared by the standards of anyone who knew the country. Hold that thought because the river is going to make it almost beside the point. He reached the Teklanika in early spring conditions and crossed it without catastrophe. That fact matters enormously, and it is the fact the myth erases. The barrier that would eventually kill him was, on the way in, nothing more than an inconvenience, a cold, wet slog across braided channels. He walked on, found Bus 142, and made it his base. And for a while, by the evidence he left behind in his own journal and in the photographs later recovered, it worked. He shot game, he foraged, he read, he lived the thing he had come to live. He stayed out there for about 113 days. Whatever you think of the decision that put him there, a person does not survive nearly 4 months alone in that country by pure luck. He was doing something right for a long time. Then, in early July, he decided it was time to walk out, and he went back to the Teklanika, and the river was gone. Not literally gone, transformed. The same crossing that had been a knee-deep nuisance in the last week of April was now, in the peak of the summer melt, a wide gray, roaring channel of glacial water, deep and fast and opaque, carrying the full afternoon load of everything the Alaska Range was shedding into the Cantwell Glacier's drainage. He stood on the bank and looked at it, and understood, correctly, that he could not cross. This was not cowardice or incompetence. It was an accurate reading of lethal water. A person who tried to wade or swim that would very likely have drowned, for every reason this story has already laid out. The cold that disables in a minute, the silt that fills and sinks you, the current that turns your legs into useless props. He made the survivable call. He turned around and walked back to the bus to wait the river out. And here is the detail that turns McCandless's death from a tragedy into an almost intolerable lesson about this specific country, the detail that the movies and the arguments about his character tend to skate right past. Roughly half a mile downstream from where he stood defeated, the United States Geological Survey had strung a steel cable across the Teklanika Gorge, part of a river gauging station, with a hand-operated aluminum basket that a person could sit in and haul themselves across the raging water using a system of pulleys, high and dry, untouched by the flood. A year later, when John Krakauer, the journalist whose book would make all of this famous, walked into the same area, he and his companions found that cable and used that basket to cross the exact river that had trapped McCandless in a few minutes without getting wet. The exit existed. It was a short walk away. McCandless simply did not know it was there because he had not carried the kind of detailed map that would have marked it, and the country does not hand out that information to people who arrive without it. The door out was never locked. He just never found the handle half a mile down the bank, while the river he could not cross held him in place. Think about what that waiting actually was, day after day, because it is the quiet center of the whole thing. He had crossed this river once already, easily. And now it stood between him and everything, and it was not going to drop for weeks, not until the heat of summer broke, and the melt slowed toward fall. He could see the far bank. He could see the country he had walked in through. The barrier was not a wall or a storm or a wild animal. Nothing you could fight or outsmart. It was moving water that simply would not stop. And the only weapon against it was time. And time was the one thing his body was running out of. That is the particular cruelty of the interior's river trap. And it is the same one that would strand the hikers who came after him. The danger is not dramatic. It does not charge you. It closes a door and waits on the other side of it, patient, while your options and your calories quietly run down, and it lets you watch the exit the entire time. So he waited, and the waiting became a slower kind of dying. Cut off by the water, unable to leave, McCandless's food situation deteriorated through July and into August. He hunted and foraged to hold the gap open. But the arithmetic of calories in a boreal forest in late summer is merciless for someone without deep skill, and he was burning more than the land was giving back. There is a specific, well-documented trap inside that arithmetic, and it has a name that sounds almost quaint until you understand it. Rabbit starvation, or in the old French-Canadian of northern hunters, mal de caribou. Lean wild meat, the kind McCandless was mostly able to get, is nearly all protein and almost no fat. Wild game in the north runs strikingly lean, especially as the animals burn down their own reserves across the seasons, and a human body cannot run on protein alone. Past a certain share of your calories, protein overwhelms the liver's ability to process the nitrogen it produces, and you can, in the grimmest fact of northern nutrition, starve with a full stomach, growing weaker and more wasted while eating what looks like plenty. Arctic explorers documented it. Hunters who lived on rabbit and lean late-season caribou sickened and wasted on a diet that should, by sheer volume, have carried them. Whatever precisely was happening in McCandless's body at the end, this is the shape of the boreal forest's cruelest lie to an outsider trying to live off it. The land looks full of food. It is full of the wrong food, protein without fat, calories that cost more to burn than they deliver. And a person leaning on it without the fat and carbohydrate to balance it can do everything right, hunt successfully, eat regularly, and still slide toward death by inches. It is one more version of the same interior pattern, a place that appears to offer exactly what you need and quietly does not. His journal entries thinned and weakened along with him. He grew steadily more emaciated. Sometime in the second half of August, by the best reconstruction, he died inside the bus, in a sleeping bag. And when moose hunters came upon the bus on the 6th of September and found him, his body weighed about 67 pounds, 30 kilograms, a starved fraction of a grown man. The bus told the rest of the story in his own hand because McCandless documented himself to the end, and what he left is among the most haunting primary records any of these deaths has produced. On the door he taped a note, printed in block capitals on a page torn from a book, and it is worth repeating because it collapses the whole situation into a few lines. It said that he was injured, near death, and too weak to hike out, that he was all alone, that this was no joke, and it begged in the name of God for anyone who came to stay and save him, explaining that he was out collecting berries nearby and would return that evening. He was rationing hope in a message to strangers who might never come. His camera was recovered with the film still inside it. And when it was developed, it held dozens of images of his months in the country, self-portraits among them. And in the late frames, you can watch the body fail, the face and limbs going gaunt. In one of the last, by the account of those who have seen it, he is sitting outside the bus, wasted, holding up a note and giving a small wave. And the note says that he has had a happy life and thanks the Lord. Whatever you make of how he got there, he met the end clear-eyed in recording it. And the country handed that record back to us intact, which is more than it usually does. He was not even identified at first. The hunters and others who reached the bus that September found a body and a camp belonging to a young man who had traveled under a made-up name and told almost no one where he was going. And it took time and slow work to trace him before his family back east learned what had become of the son they had not heard from in more than 2 years. That silence is part of the same pattern. He had cut his links deliberately, changed his name, stopped writing home, precisely to be free of the world's schedule, and the freedom worked exactly as designed right up until it killed him, because the same disconnection that made the adventure feel pure also meant that when the river closed behind him, no one knew to come, and no one knew where to look. The interior did not have to hunt him down. He had already removed himself from every chain that might have pulled him back. What actually killed him at the cellular level is a fight that has never fully ended, and it deserves to be handled carefully rather than dramatically, because the disagreement is real and the honest answer is that the underlying story does not depend on winning it. The medical examiner's determination was starvation. Krakauer, trying to explain how a resourceful young man eating what he could find could still starve, proposed over the years a series of theories that the wild potato, Hedysarum alpinum, whose roots and seeds McCandless was eating, might have been doing him harm, first suggesting a toxic mold, then a specific neurotoxin, then, after commissioning laboratory work, pointing to a compound called L-canavanine in the seeds. Chemists at the University of Alaska, including researchers who actually analyzed the plant, pushed back hard and repeatedly, finding no meaningful toxin in the seeds and arguing that the science did not support the poisoning narrative. That argument is genuinely unsettled, and this story is not going to pretend it can settle it. But notice what both sides agree on, because that is the part that matters. Everyone agrees he was starving. Everyone agrees his margin had collapsed to nothing. The toxin, if it existed, would only be the last small push against a man already at the edge of a cliff. And the reason he was at that cliff, the reason he could not simply resupply or walk to help when his body started to fail, was the river. The Teclanica is what held him at the bus long enough for the slow math of starvation to finish, whatever the final variable turned out to be. That is what makes his death the hinge of the whole story, and it is where the central question stops being abstract. Chris McCandless did not die of the Alaskan cold. He walked in on foot in the spring, alive and capable, and he died in the warmth of late summer, within a few miles of a road, beside a stove and a roof, with a hand-operated cable crossing half a mile away, because a river that had been harmless in April had become impassable in July and closed the only route he knew. The land looked benign the entire time. The weapon was the calendar. There is even formal research pointing the same direction. A study out of Oregon State University, examining the conditions around his death, concluded in effect that McCandless was undone less by character than by timing, that the season and the state of the river turned what could have been a survivable stay into a fatal one. You can accept that framing or push back on it, but it aims at exactly the thing this story keeps circling. In the interior, when you do something can matter more than how well you do it. And the easiest thing in the world, the thing almost everyone does, is to file McCandless under his own naivety, to say he was unprepared, and leave it there, comfortable in the belief that the river only catches the foolish. Except the river did not stop with him. Krakauer's book came out in 1996, and the film adaptation followed in 2007, and together they did something no one intended. They turned Bus 142 into a shrine. The story of the young man who walked into the wild and did not walk out struck a nerve in a very large number of people, and a meaningful fraction of them decided they needed to go and see the actual bus, to sit in it, to stand where he stood. They came from all over the world, and they kept coming year after year in a steady pilgrimage up the Stampede Trail toward the clearing in the spruce. And every single one of them, to reach it, had to cross the Titlanica. Understand what that means as a machine for producing tragedy. You now had a continuous supply of people, most of them not seasoned Alaskans, many of them from places with no glacial rivers at all, drawn by an emotional story to a specific object on the far side of the exact hazard that stories should have taught them to fear. They were not going into the interior to test themselves against the unknown. They were going to a landmark, a destination with a name and a legend. And a destination feels safe in a way that raw wilderness does not, because the fact that other people have been there reads to the human brain as proof that it can be done. The river did not care about the legend. It rose every summer afternoon exactly as it always had, indifferent to how many people had crossed it the week before, and it waited. It is worth asking plainly why they kept coming, because the answer is not stupidity. And treating it as stupidity misses the entire mechanism. Denali and the interior are a genuine draw. Hundreds of thousands of people travel to this part of Alaska every year, most of them to stand near the biggest mountain on the continent and the wild country around it. The bus added something more specific and more powerful than scenery. Krakauer's book and the film built from it turned McCandless into a figure people identified with. A stand-in for the urge to walk away from a life that feels boxed in and meet something real. And the bus became the physical altar of that urge, a place you could go to touch the story. That is a motive as old as the interior itself, the same pull that drew the gold stampeders up the rivers and the photographers into the backcountry, and the young man himself up the Stampede Trail, the belief that out past the last road, there is a truer version of your life waiting. The country does not argue with that belief. It simply attaches a cost the belief tends to hide, and a destination is uniquely good at hiding it. The Titlanica does not look the same to a person on its bank as an anonymous glacial river would, even though that is exactly what it is. The legend had crossed that river 1,000 times without drowning. The water never noticed, and it never changed. On the 14th of August, 2010, it took Claire Ackerman, she was 29, from Switzerland, traveling with a companion, a Frenchman in his late 20s. And by every account, this was not a careless pair blundering into the water. They understood that the Titlanica was dangerous. They respected it, and they did the thing that seems most responsible, the thing that on paper is a safety measure. They rigged a rope. They tied a line across to the far bank, anchored to the trees and brush, so that they would have something to hold, a fixed connection against the push of the current, and they clipped and held onto it and started across the swollen river together. And the rope, the safety measure, is what killed her. This is the reversal, and it is worth slowing down on because it is so counterintuitive and so brutally instructive. In fast water, a rope that holds you to a fixed point does not save you when you lose your feet. It converts you into an anchor. The current knocked them off balance. The crane off balance, and instead of being swept downstream where a swimmer at least has a chance to angle toward a bank, they were held by the line, pinned against the full force of a glacial river that piled onto them and drove them under. The water that this story has already described, the cold that fires the gasp reflex, the silt that fills and sinks, the current that will not let up, now had them tethered in place, unable to go with it and unable to fight it. The Frenchman managed to cut himself free and reach the bank. Then he cut Claire Ackerman free, but by then she had been under and in the grip of that water, and when she came loose, she floated. not swam, down the river, roughly half a mile downstream before he could get her out. He tried to resuscitate her on the gravel. It did not work. She died there, on the bank of the Teclanica, less than a mile from the bus she had come to see. To understand why the rope betrayed them, picture what fast water does with anything fixed in it. Whitewater rescuers have a word for a hazard that lets water through but catches a body, a strainer, a branch, or a net in the current, and it is among the most feared things in moving water, because the flow that passes freely will pin a person against it under tons of pressure and simply hold them there. A rope stretched bank to bank with a person clinging to it can become exactly that. When the current took Claire Ackerman's footing, the line did not lift her. It held her in place against the full weight of the river while the water stacked over her. A tether keeps you from going downstream, where a swimmer at least has room to angle toward a bank, and it keeps you from getting your face up where you might survive the first minute. It trades the one thing that can save you, mobility, for a false sense of security. That is the cruelty of it. The precaution that feels most responsible is, in a glacial river, a way to convert a fall into a drowning. She was not careless. She was betrayed by an instinct that is correct almost everywhere else on Earth and lethal here. Sit with what her death proves, because it detonates the comfortable explanation. Claire Ackerman was not Chris McCandless. She was not underprepared in the way the myth accuses him of being. She recognized the danger, she respected it, and she took a deliberate precaution against it. And the precaution became the mechanism of her death, because the country's specific hazard, fast, cold, silt-laden water, punishes exactly the instincts that keep you alive in gentler places. Roping into a fixed line is sound practice in plenty of situations. Against a glacial river in flood, it is a way to hold a person underwater. The Teclanica did not require its victim to be foolish. It only required her to be human, to bring the wrong, correct instinct to a river that rewrites the rules, and to arrive in summer when the water was high. So the thread the story has been holding since McCandless snaps taut here. Was he an outlier, a naive kid whose fate said nothing about anyone more sensible? No. The same water at the same crossing, in the same season, killed a respectful, cautious adult who did more to protect herself than he ever did, and it killed her using her own caution as the weapon. That should have been the end of it. After 2010, the lesson was written in the plainest possible terms, in a death that made international news, and the sensible expectation is that the pilgrimage would stop, or that the crossing would be closed, or that the story would at last teach the thing it was supposed to teach. The pilgrimage did not stop, and 9 years later, the river did it again. On the 25th of July, 2019, close to midnight in the long northern dusk, a 24-year-old man named Piotr Markielau made a call to the Alaska State Troopers to report that his wife had been dragged under the Teclanica and that he had not been able to save her. Her name, as troopers reported it, was Veronika Mikamava, though it appeared in different forms across the accounts that followed. And even the spelling of the name of the woman who died is one of the small uncertainties the record carries. She was 24 as well, from Belarus, an actress who had appeared as a young performer in a well-known war film before moving toward a new life abroad. She and Markielau had been married less than a month. This was, in the most literal sense, their honeymoon, and they had chosen to spend part of it making the pilgrimage up the Stampede Trail to the bus, the same walk, the same clearing, the same crossing. The river was running high and fast, swollen that summer, not only by the ordinary glacial melt, but by recent rain on top of it. They attempted the crossing anyway, two young people at the start of a marriage, on foot, in the country that has been swallowing exactly such people for decades. Veronika was swept off her feet and pulled under. By the time Markielau reached her and dragged her from the water, something on the order of 75 to 100 feet downstream, she was already dead. He was left alone on the bank in the half-dark with his wife's body and a phone call to make to troopers who were hours away, and the marriage was over almost before it had started, ended by a river, a short walk from a bus. That rain is worth pausing on, because it is the interior adding a second hand to the trap. Glacial melt alone follows the sun on its daily and seasonal rhythm, which at least gives a careful person a pattern to try to learn. Rain does not wait for the afternoon and does not care about the pattern. A summer storm dumping water into a drainage already swollen with melt can lift a braided river hard and fast, stacking runoff on top of meltwater and turning a marginal crossing into an impossible one in a matter of hours at any time of the day or night. It was the same cold, silt-heavy water that had killed Claire Ackerman 9 years earlier, and the fishing fleet's crews for decades before that, only with its timing pushed further out of reach, able to turn against a person at an hour when nothing in the day's rhythm gave any warning. Forecasting can see the melt coming. It is far worse at seeing where and when the rain will land. And this is where the recurrence stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern with a shape you can read. Line them up. 1992, Chris McCandless, trapped by the summer Tiklanaka and dead of starvation at the bus. 2010, Claire Ackerman, drowned in the summer Tiklanaka crossing to the bus. 2019, Veronika Maikamava, drowned in the summer Tiklanaka crossing to the bus. 27 years, 3 deaths that the wider world heard about, the same river, the same season, the same short stretch of gravel and water, and around those 3, a thicker cloud of episodes that never became famous. The hikers who turned back at the last second, the groups that had to be pulled out, the search and rescue call-outs for people who underestimated the crossing and got lucky. The Tiklanaka was not a freak that caught one unprepared boy. It was a stable, repeating trap, and the legend of the bus had turned it into a machine that fed itself a fresh supply of victims every summer. Because the story that drew people to the far bank was the very story that should have kept them off the near one. And for every one of those 3 deaths that reached the headlines, the crossing generated a steady traffic of near misses that did not, which is the part of the record that shows how routine the trap had become. Between 2009 and 2017, the state of Alaska mounted 15 separate search and rescue operations tied to that one stretch of the Stampede Trail and its river. 15 times that public crews and aircraft were spent pulling people out of a situation the Tiklanaka had made. The pattern in them is numbingly consistent, and it is always the same mechanism this story has been laying out. People crossed the river while it was low, walked to the bus, and discovered on the way back that the water had risen behind them into something they could not recross, the exact door that shuts behind you that trapped McCandless. Except these people were on the far side of it and still alive, stranded, waiting for someone to come. In June of 2013, 3 hikers were caught this way, one of them slowed by a twisted ankle. They had forded the Tiklanaka when it was passable, and within a day the water climbed to impassable, and they were stuck. What saved them is the detail that should unsettle anyone who imagines rescue in this country as a phone call. They were pulled out because they happened to spot a CH-47 Chinook helicopter that happened to be out of Fort Wainwright on a training mission west of Healy and managed to flag it down. Not because a system found them, because a military aircraft that had no idea they existed flew close enough to be seen. That same spring, 3 German hikers stranded by the same river had to be rescued by state troopers. In 2016, 2 Americans reached the bus and were swept downstream trying to cross back and had to be lifted out by helicopter. Later that same summer, a Canadian man made it to the bus, was injured, could not recross the swollen river, and also had to be flown out. Walk through what a rescue on that river actually demands, because it explains both why so many of these ended in a helicopter and why the three that mattered most ended in a body. First, someone has to know you are in trouble, which out here can take days, since a stranded hiker with no signal cannot call, and a party is often not even reported overdue until well after they should have been home. Then someone has to decide to act and to commit an aircraft, which means authorization, a crew, a machine, a plan. Then the weather has to allow the flight, in a country that grounds aircraft as a matter of routine. Then the aircraft has to find the people in terrain built to hide them. Then it has to reach them, to a place it can safely approach or land. Then it has to get them aboard and out. Every one of those steps eats time, and everyone can fail. And the river does not pause while they play out. The people who lived through their crossings mostly lived because one link happened to hold, or because an aircraft happened to be near, or simply because they were on the surviving side of the water when it rose. Claire Ackerman and Veronika Maikamava were not given that time. They went into the water, the 1-minute clock started, and there is no rescue chain on Earth that reaches a person inside of a minute. And the chain is not only slow, it is dangerous to the people who form it. Every one of those rescue flights puts a crew into the same weather and the same terrain that created the emergency. In a state where flying is already the deadliest ordinary thing a person can do, where the aviation accident rate runs at multiples of the national figure for exactly the reasons that make the rescue hard in the first place. A helicopter threading a river valley in marginal weather to reach a stranded hiker is exposed to the identical low cloud, sudden wind, and unforgiving ground that trapped the hiker. The interior does not exempt the rescuers. It offers them the same trap, at speed, with more moving parts. And the history of Alaskan search and rescue includes crews who did not come back from going after someone else who did not come back. That is the part the word rescue quietly hides. It sounds like safety arriving. Out here it is one more set of people accepting the interior's terms, betting that their skill and their machine can beat the distance and the weather for the length of a single mission, and mostly, but not always, winning. The newest tools have changed the edges of this without touching the center. A satellite messenger or a personal locator beacon, the kind more and more backcountry travelers now carry, can punch a distress signal out of a place with no cell coverage and drop a precise location into a rescue center within minutes. And that genuinely saves lives, because it collapses the first and slowest link in the chain. The part where nobody even knows you are in trouble. But look hard at what it cannot do. It cannot make an aircraft fly in weather that grounds aircraft. It cannot pull a helicopter across 100 miles of country any faster than a helicopter crosses it. And it cannot reach into a river and hold a person's face above cold water for the 60 seconds that decide whether they live. A beacon shortens the wait for help. It does nothing about the distance help has to cross or the minute the water gives, which is why people carrying the best emergency electronics money can buy have still died on these crossings. The signal goes out. The distance stays exactly as long as it always was. Forecasting runs into the same wall from the other side. It is genuinely possible now to know, days ahead, that a hot spell is coming and that the glacial rivers will run high, and a careful party can use that to time a crossing for the cold hours near dawn, when the melt is at its lowest and the water is down. That knowledge is real, and it saves the people who respect it. But knowing the river will rise is a different thing from being able to get across it before it does. The Teklanica can come up faster than a person can cover the 10 miles of trail back to it. So a hiker who fords it in the safe gray of morning and lingers too long at the bus can walk back down in the afternoon to exactly the flood the forecast predicted and be trapped behind water. The science saw coming, and the schedule still delivered on time. The information was correct. The timing beat them anyway. That is the interior's blunt answer to the modern faith that enough data equals safety. Out here, the data can be perfect, and the distance and the clock will still close the door, because a forecast is a description of what the water is about to do, not a bridge over it. It tells you the trap is arming. It does nothing to move you to the safe side of it. And where the only way back is on foot across the very thing that is rising, being warned and being saved are not the same. Which raises a hard, practical question that the state of Alaska was, by now, being forced to answer. If the danger is fixed, if the river will keep rising every July no matter what anyone writes on a sign, and if people will keep coming as long as the thing they are coming to see is out there waiting, then what exactly do you do? You cannot drain a glacial river. You cannot post a ranger at a crossing in the roadless backcountry. You cannot argue with a legend. The hazard was not something you could fix. So the authorities eventually reached for the only variable in the whole system that was actually within human power to change. Not the river, the reason people were crossing it. On the 18th of June, 2020, the state of Alaska did something that, put in a single sentence, sounds almost absurd. It sent a military heavy-lift helicopter into the backcountry to pick up a broken 60-year-old bus and fly it away. Strip the absurdity off, though, and it was one of the clearest admissions of defeat by a landscape that any government has ever made. The Alaska Department of Natural Resources, which manages the state land the bus sat on, had concluded that Bus 142 could not be left where it was, because it had become, in the commissioner's own framing, a magnet drawing far too many people who were simply not prepared for what the trip demanded. The bus itself hurt no one. The bus was a hunk of rusted steel in a meadow, but the bus was the reason, and the only reason anyone could actually remove that a steady stream of the unprepared kept walking up to a killing river and trying to cross it. So if you cannot take away the river, you take away the destination. Before it came to that, the obvious alternatives were weighed and set aside, and the reasoning is worth following, because it is the same logic the whole story has been building. You could try to make the crossing safer. A footbridge, a permanent cable car like the gauging stations, better signs warning people off in high water. But every one of those either cost far more than a remote, barely official trail could justify, or worse, would have done the one thing guaranteed to make the problem bigger, made the bus easier and more inviting to reach, and so drawn even more unprepared people to the edge of a river that would still, on the wrong afternoon, kill them. A safer-looking crossing to a famous destination is not a solution in a country like this. It is an advertisement. The authorities understood that they could not make the Teclanica safe, and that anything encouraging more people to try it was working against them. And that left exactly one lever that reduced the danger instead of feeding it. Remove the reason to cross. Watch how the operation actually unfolded, because the logistics of getting the bus out are, in a dark way, the perfect mirror of the logistics that make rescue so hard in this country, and they say everything about why the interior wins. This was not a matter of driving a truck out and towing the thing back. There is no road. That was the entire point. Removing Bus 142 required an aircraft and not a small one. The mission fell to the Alaska Army National Guard, to soldiers of an aviation regiment flying a CH-47 Chinook, the big twin-rotor heavy-lift helicopter built to sling artillery and vehicles beneath it. Getting to that point took coordination between the Guard and the Department of Natural Resources, an authorization, a plan, a crew, a machine capable of the lift, and a weather window good enough to fly a precision sling load in and out of the backcountry near Healy. A team had to go in on the ground first, to the clearing, to rig the bus, to prepare it to be picked up without tearing apart in the air. Then the Chinook came in, took the weight of Bus 142 on a line beneath its belly, lifted it out of the spot where an axle had failed in the early 1960s, and carried it off over the country it had sat in for nearly 6 decades. Now hold that image next to the deaths, and the reversal lands with its full weight. It took a military helicopter, a specialized crew, an interagency authorization, a ground rigging team, and a good weather day to extract one stationary object from that landscape under ideal, planned, non-emergency conditions, with all the time in the world to get it right. That is the level of machinery the modern world has to bring to bear just to remove a bus from the interior on a nice day in June. Then think about Carl McCunn, or Claire Ackerman, or Veronika Mikamava, needing that same reach, that same lift, that same coordination, but instantly unplanned, at the wrong hour, maybe in bad weather, at the exact moment the country had already begun to close on them. The bus got the full weight of American logistics because the operation could wait for the perfect conditions. A drowning person cannot wait, and the interior almost never offers the perfect conditions on demand. The removal of Bus 142 was, without meaning to be, a demonstration of the precise gap that kills people out there, the gap between what rescue requires and what the country allows in the moment you need it. The bus survived its own removal, which is its own quiet irony. It was not scrapped. Recognizing that the object had become a genuine piece of cultural history, however uncomfortable, the state arranged for it to be preserved, and it went to the University of Alaska's Museum of the North in Fairbanks, where it could be conserved and eventually seen by anyone who wanted to see it, safely, on the near side of the park's highway, with no river between them and the thing. Getting it there was its own long process. After the airlift, the bus was moved to the university, and conservators went to work on a piece of steel that had spent 6 decades in the weather, and then years as an unofficial shrine, cut and marked and worn by the people who had come to it. Some of them carving names, some carrying pieces away. The decision was to give it a permanent, stabilized home at the Museum of the North, displayed with its whole history told plainly, the McCandless story, and the Utan work crews, and the deaths on the river, all part of one account, rather than a myth scrubbed clean. The pilgrimage now has a legal, dry, river-free destination a short drive from the middle of Fairbanks, which is the entire point. You can stand inside Bus 142 today and put your hand on the same metal, and the only thing you have to cross to reach it is a parking lot. Not everyone welcomed the move. To some, hauling the bus out with a helicopter felt like erasing a piece of real history, sanding the danger off a story whose danger was the point, turning a wild grave marker into a display behind a rope. To others, mostly the people who actually live and work and run rescues in that country, and who had spent a decade watching strangers drown or strand themselves reaching a bus, it was overdue common sense. Both reactions are understandable, and the tension between them is the same one running under this whole story, the pull of the wild place set against the plain arithmetic of who it kills. The state came down on the side of the arithmetic. It decided that a landmark, which reliably lured unprepared people across a deadly river, was not worth the bodies, however powerful the story attached to it, and that if the only way to stop the dying was to take the destination away, then the destination would go. That is the resolution to the pilgrimage problem that finally worked. You could keep the object and its story alive for the people who were moved by it, and you could do it without feeding anyone to the Teklanika, by simply moving the destination to a place that does not require crossing a glacial flood to reach. The bus is still here. The danger it created is not, because the danger was never in the steel. It was in the space around it, in the 8 or 10 miles of trail and the one gray river that stood between a person and the legend. And that is the reversal the whole middle of this story has been building toward, the one that reframes everything. For nearly 30 years, the bus was treated as the point, the thing McCandless died in, the shrine, the object. It was never the point. The bus was just the bait. The actual predator was the country itself, the roadless distance and the rising summer water. And the bus's only real role in the deaths was to give people a reason to walk into range of it. Take the bus out of the equation, and the country is exactly as lethal as it ever was. It just, for the moment, has one fewer lure standing in it. The state solved the problem of Bus 142. It did not, and could not, solve the problem of the interior, because the Teklanika still rises every July. The Stampede Trail is still out there, and the same country that swallowed a bus for 60 years and 3 pilgrims across 3 decades holds, out beyond that one small famous clearing, 10,000 identical traps that nobody has made a movie about yet. To see that the Teklanika is a single instance of a general rule, rather than a unique cursed river, step back from it and look at what the same underlying system does with a completely different tool. Water is one way the interior removes your options in summer. Fire is another. And it works on the same logic. The logic that the warm months are the dangerous ones, and that the country's real weapon is not any single force, but the way distance amplifies every force into something rescue cannot reach in time. The summer of 2004. Jaws 4 is the case that makes this undeniable, and it is worth stating plainly because it runs so hard against the frozen death trap picture. That year, interior Alaska burned on a scale that had no precedent in the modern record. It was the warmest summer on the books, and one of the driest the interior had seen in nearly a century of observation. And the heat did 2 things at once. It dried the boreal forest and the underlying peat into fuel, and it drove the kind of atmospheric instability that breeds thunderstorms, and those storms delivered lightning in a quantity that dwarfed anything normal, on the order of several times the usual seasonal count of strikes. Lightning into tinder does exactly what you would expect. By the end of the season, something like 6.5 million acres of Alaska had burned, more than 10,000 square miles, a record in the 50-year database, most of it in the interior, in a few hundred fires that in places simply could not be stopped and were left to run. Fairbanks spent that summer under a pall of smoke thick enough to be its own hazard, the air a public health emergency for weeks, the sun a dim orange smear. One arm of that season has a name, the Taylor Complex, a cluster of fires off the Taylor Highway near the Canada border that started from lightning at the end of June and grew into a single burn of more than 1.25 million acres, the largest wildfire anywhere in the United States, for a decade on either side of it. It took no lives and destroyed almost nothing built, and that is precisely the tell. It was allowed to burn largely because it was out in country so empty and so roadless that there was little to defend and little way to reach it, which is another way of saying that the same remoteness that makes the interior deadly to a person in trouble also makes its fires unfightable and, mostly, empty enough not to matter. The interior touched 90 degrees that summer, bone dry, and it simply burned until the weather turned. For the people of the interior, that summer was not an abstraction about acreage. It was months of living inside smoke. Fairbanks and the towns around it spent long stretches under air so thick with wildfire smoke that the sun was a dull disk, and the far end of a street disappeared. Air that health authorities warned was genuinely dangerous to breathe, especially for the old, the young, and anyone with weak lungs. Flights were disrupted when the smoke closed in, which in a place that runs on aircraft is its own kind of isolation. The sky rode shut not by cold or storm, but by the country burning. People stayed indoors through the middle of the long, bright days, sealed their houses against the smell, and waited, because there was nothing to do but wait for a change in the weather that no one could hurry. It was the same helplessness the river teaches, rendered in air instead of water, a force released by the summer heat, working at a scale far past any individual's power to fight, in a country too big and too empty to defend, leaving people to seal their houses and wait, with no move available to them but patience. And a boreal fire is not the grass fire most people imagine. It burns down into the peat and the thick organic mat of the forest floor, so that the ground itself smolders and the fire can outlast rain and creep for weeks. A big one throws off so much heat that it generates its own wind and its own weather, hurling embers far ahead of the front to start new fires, moving faster than a person on foot could ever hope to outrun across Muskegon deadfall. In 2004, the lightning that lit it all came in a barrage several times. The normal count of strikes, thousands of ignitions across a tinder-dry interior in a single season, more than any firefighting force on Earth could have chased down, even with roads, which the interior does not have. A fire like that is not so much fought as outlived. You get out of its way, or you wait on the weather, and in between you hope the wind does not swing it toward you. Notice that this is the identical machine as the river, just expressed in flame. Geography lays down a vast, continuous carpet of boreal fuel with almost no roads to break it or to reach it. Weather, the warm, dry summer, activates the fuel. A physical force, fire driven by wind and terrain, generates something that moves faster than a person and closes routes behind them. And the interior's permanent condition, the roadlessness and the distance, means that firefighting, like rescue, is overwhelmingly an aviation problem, a matter of getting crews and water and retardant to places that have no other way in, and of pulling people out of the path of something that does not wait. The same summer that floods the Teclanica is the summer that dries the forest to powder. The warm season is not the safe season here. It is the season when every kind of energy the country stores gets released at once, and when the distances that were merely inconvenient in winter become the difference between an emergency that gets answered and one that does not. And the timing that this whole story turns on, the schedule of ice and melt and fire, is not fixed. It is shifting, and there is a peculiarly good record of the shift, because the interior has been keeping accidental score for more than a century. In the town of Nenana, on the Tanana River just southwest of Fairbanks, people have run a contest since 1917 called the Ice Classic, betting on the exact minute the river ice will break up in spring. Each year they plant a wooden tripod out on the frozen Tanana, wired to a clock on shore, and when the ice goes out and the tripod moves, the clock stops and records the moment. It was never meant to be science. But because the tripod goes in the same place every year, on a single-channel river with no dams upstream beside an isolated town, it has produced one of the cleanest long-run records of spring breakup anywhere on Earth, an unbroken annual measurement from 1917 to now. And that record shows the ice going out earlier. The average breakup runs on the order of a week and a half earlier in the year than it did in the early and middle decades of the last century. An earlier breakup is not a curiosity. It means the melt season starts sooner. And with warmer summers, it can run harder, which is precisely the lever that fills a river like the Teclanica. It means the window, when the country looks green and inviting, opens wider at both ends. And the same warming that pulls breakup forward lengthens and sharpens the fire season, drying the boreal forest sooner and holding it dangerous longer, so that a year like 2004 starts to look less like a freak and more like a preview. Here honesty matters, because it would be easy and wrong to turn this into a tidy story of a warming Arctic making everything more dangerous in a straight line. The interior system is more tangled than that. Less river ice or an earlier thaw does not translate cleanly into safer or into more dangerous. It reshapes the timing and the force of the hazards rather than deleting them. What the record actually shows is that the schedule the entire system runs on, the one the Athabascan calendar read so precisely and the one outsiders keep misjudging, is itself now moving, so that even hard-earned local knowledge of when a river is safe or when the forest is ready to burn has to be relearned against a target that will not hold still. The trap is not going away. It is sliding its dates, and for a country that kills by timing, that is not reassurance. It is the opposite. And breakup is not only a date on a calendar. When it goes wrong, it does, at the scale of whole towns, exactly what the Teklenica does to one person, and the record of that is recent and specific. In May of 2009, the Yukon River broke up hard at the old gold rush town of Eagle in the eastern interior, and an ice jam formed about 10 miles downstream, a plug of shattered river ice that turned the Yukon into a dam. Behind it, the water rose more than 30 feet in 48 hours, and it came not as clean flood, but as a moving wall studded with slabs of ice several feet thick, which drove into the waterfront, shoved buildings off their foundations, and in the neighboring Eagle Village destroyed the place almost entirely. The ice on the river that year had frozen to nearly 5 feet thick, some 40% above normal, and a heavy snow winter met an above-average warm spring, and the two schedules, the freezing and the melting, collided into the worst flood in the town's recorded history. 4 years later, in the spring of 2013, the same thing happened to Galena, a mostly Alaska Native village of around 400 people on the Yukon, farther west. An ice jam choked a bend in the river, the water climbed more than 15 feet in a single night, and something like 90% of the town's buildings were wrecked, some lifted off their foundations and carried away. More than 120 people had to be pulled out in a late-night evacuation, most of them flown out by air, because when the river does this, there is often no other way out at all. Look at who did that flying, because it is the same apparatus every wilderness emergency in this country eventually leans on. Alaska keeps what its crews call a rescue triad, 3 Air National Guard squadrons out of the 176th Wing near Anchorage, 1 flying helicopters, 1 flying long-range HC-130 aircraft, and 1 of pararescue men, the specialists trained to actually reach people and keep them alive, all coordinated through a rescue center that watches the entire territory. It is a genuinely elite, genuinely dedicated capability, better than almost anywhere else in the country has for its wild country, and it is still spread over a place so vast that the words those crews live by, that others may live, run headlong into simple geometry. A handful of helicopters and a handful of fixed-wing aircraft and a few dozen rescuers, however good, cannot be close to everywhere at once across a territory that size. They launch, they fly, they save lives constantly, and they still cannot beat distance, and distance is the interior's permanent ally. The grim totals sit underneath all of it and refuse to improve. Alaska has, year after year, the highest drowning rate in the United States, well above the national figure, and the highest rate of missing persons of any state by a wide margin, well over 100 people per 100,000, a number that looks like a misprint next to anywhere else. And the single most consistent finding in the drowning data is the one the fishing fleet already showed, and the one every river crossing repeats. The great majority of the people who drown in Alaska's cold water are not wearing flotation. 3/4 of boating victims and worse going into water that gives a body about a minute of grace with nothing to hold their face above it. The state that most depends on cold water and remoteness pays for that dependence in exactly the currency this whole story has been describing, and no amount of rescue skill has changed the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is set by the land, not by the people trying to beat it. And this is where the whole chain finally locks together, every link this story has laid down, into one clear shape. Start with geography, 2 mountain walls, and a roadless basin between them the size of a country, drained by braided rivers, carpeted in flammable forest, with a bare handful of highways, and no other way across most of it but the sky. Add weather, and specifically add the counterintuitive truth that the dangerous weather here is warmth, because warmth is what melts the ice into flood and dries the forest into fuel and stretches the days into a light that fools people into pressing on. Add the physical forces that warmth unlocks, cold silt-choked water that rises every afternoon and disables a body in a minute, and fire that eats the country faster than anyone can flee it. Add human motive, which is the ignition for all of it. The photographer chasing his images, the young man chasing his idea of freedom, the pilgrims chasing a story that moved them, every one of them bringing an outside schedule into a place that keeps only its own. Add technology, the bush plane and the satellite beacon, and the highway, which genuinely open the country and genuinely save lives, and which also, every time, quietly widen the circle of people willing to walk into range of the trap, because a danger that looks manageable draws in exactly the people least equipped to survive it when it stops being manageable. And then, under all of it, the constant that never changes, no matter what century you are in: distance. Rescue is not a thing that happens when help appears beside you. It is a chain. Someone has to know you are in trouble. Someone has to be able to reach you. An aircraft has to fly. Weather has to permit it. The asset has to exist and be free. And every one of those links stretches longer out here than almost anywhere else on the continent. The interior kills by making that chain too long to hold before your options run out. That is the answer to the question this whole story opened on. And it is worth saying it flat, because it is the opposite of what the postcard tells you. This is a place everyone pictures as a frozen death trap, and the frozen part is the least of it. Winter is honest. It announces itself, and it forces the respect that keeps people alive. It is the warm months that do the real killing, because summer is when the ice becomes flood and the forest becomes fire, when the country looks most like a place you could handle, and when the distances that separate you from help are working at their worst against a body that a river or a burn can put in crisis in a matter of seconds. The cold is the reputation. The thaw is the threat. Say it even more plainly, because the whole design of the place hides it. The interior does not kill mainly with its famous extreme. It kills with the ordinary warm day, the 70-degree afternoon under a blue sky, because that is the day the ice is pouring off the mountains into the rivers, and the forest is drying toward its flashpoint, and the country looks, to anyone who does not already know it, like the safest possible place to be. The cold at least tells the truth about itself. The warmth lies, and the lie is convincing precisely because it is beautiful. A person stands on a gravel bar in the sun, a few miles from a road, in shirt sleeves, looking at a gray river and a green forest and a sky full of light. And every signal their senses hand them says this is fine. And the only thing that would say otherwise is knowledge they did not bring and cannot see about what the sun is doing to the ice upstream, and how far the nearest help really is, and how little time the water actually gives. That gap between how the place looks and what it is doing is the whole trap, and it has not closed in 100 years. And the reason the prepared and the careful and the almost rescued keep dying here is that the trap is not made of any one force you could pack against. It is made of geography and warmth and water and fire and motive and distance, assembled into a system that has been catching people in the same few ways since long before Carl McCunn waved the wrong arm at a passing plane, and that will keep catching them long after the last person alive remembers why a bus once sat out on the Stampede Trail. Which is where this ends, back at the one crossing that has done more of this work than any other. And that is now, in a sense, quieter than it has ever been. The bus is gone from the clearing beyond the Teclanica. Fly over that spot today, and you will find only the flattened place in the spruce, where it sat for 60 years, an empty rectangle of ground going back to brush, the pilgrimage broken because the thing people came for is safe in a museum on the other side of the highway. No shrine, no stele. Nothing out there to walk toward anymore. The people still come, in a way. They come to Fairbanks, to the museum, and they stand inside the bus where it rests now, dry and safe and going nowhere. and they read the story and put a hand on the metal. And for almost all of them, that is the whole of it, and it is enough. The pilgrimage did not end. It just stopped requiring a river, which is the closest thing to a solution this entire story contains. And it is worth noticing how small it is. Nobody tamed the country. Nobody fixed the crossing. They moved one object out of the water's reach and let the water go on being exactly what it is. But the river is exactly where it was. Every summer, the sun climbs over the Alaska Range and works on the Cantwell Glacier the way it has for 10,000 years. And every afternoon, the meltwater comes down cold and gray and heavy. And the Teklanika swells across its gravel and runs deep and fast and opaque through the warm, bright hours, indifferent, on schedule, doing precisely what the calendar tells it to do. It rises whether or not anyone is standing on the bank. It has no memory of the people it has taken and no interest in the ones still to come. And somewhere out in that enormous roadless country, this summer or the next, someone is looking across a bright, harmless-seeming, hundreds of miles from help stretch of interior Alaska in the warm part of the year, deciding it looks like a place a careful person could cross,